Zootopia 2 has come home to Disney+.
Let's go!
Get ready for a new case.
We're the greatest partners of all time!
New friends.
Gary the Snake.
And your last name?
The Snake.
Dream Team.
New habitats.
Zootopia has a secret reptile population.
You can watch the record-breaking phenomenon at home. Zootopia 2, now available on Disney+, rated PG. And right now you can get Disney Plus and Hulu for just $4.99 a month for 3 months with a special limited time offer. Ends March 24th. After 3 months, plan auto-renews at $12.99 a month. Terms apply.
Are you stuck staring at your W-2? Are tax refund worries holding you back? You probably have FOMO, the fear of messing up. The fix? Using TurboTax on Intuit Credit Karma. They find every credit and deduction to help you get every refund dollar you deserve. Or your money back. It's time to overcome your fear of messing up and get your taxes done right. Start filing today in the Credit Karma app.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Abraham Lincoln's immortal words and speeches, including the Gettysburg Address and his second inaugural address, resonate through the ages. But as my guest for this episode shares, credit is due not just to the orator, but to his in-house speechwriter. Jan Cigliano Hartman is an award-winning historian of 8 books that portray the history of American life. Her book, Showplace of America, has sold over 20,000 units and remains in print after 30 years. Other books by her include Private Washington, Grand American Avenue, and The Women Who Changed Architecture. A graduate of Oberlin College and George Washington University, Jan is a fellow at the Massachusetts Historical Society, was a resident scholar at the American Academy in Rome, and was a visiting researcher at Brown University's John Hay Library. She is also principal of Jan Hartman Books, a book producer, and formerly senior editor with Princeton Architectural Press. We had an amazing conversation about her latest book, Lincoln's Speechwriter, John Hay and the Friendship That Inspired American Eloquence. But as always, there is still so much more to be found in her book. Thus, I highly encourage you to pick up a copy. I'll have a link to Jan's book on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. Without further ado, after this brief message, let's get to our discussion.
Going outside is so in during Springfest at Lowe's. For a limited time, get extra big deals on select Holland pavers, 3 for $1. Plus, save $70 on a Charbroil Performance 4-burner grill, now $179. And chef-up shareables for your whole crew. Picture-perfect patios and good food? Yes, please. Our best lineup is here at Lowe's. Valid through 3/30 while supplies last. Selection varies by location. Paver offer exclusive Alaska and Hawaii.
Jan, thank you so much for joining us on Presidencies today.
Thank you.
So glad to have you and so glad to be talking about this book. I have to admit, John Hay has become one of my obsessions in terms of presidential history. I love learning about folks who aren't as well known, but also, and as you illustrate in your book, have a major impact on American history and presidential history. And so I'm just so excited about this conversation.
Thank you. Me too.
And so to get us started, you noted in your book that you had originally begun, quote, a cradle-to-grave biography of Hay, but ultimately abandoned that project. Can you tell us why that was put aside to give way to what became Lincoln's speechwriter?
Yeah, it was basically business. I presented a cradle-to-grave biography of John Hay about 10 years after a journalist, a well-known journalist, had also published a biography of John Hay that did not do as well as the trade expected. And so when I presented my proposal to publishers, they were like, I don't know. And can you do this? Do you want to write a history of the Republican Party? I don't, the Republican Party of Lincoln's day is much different than the Republican Party of today. But I just thought that's not the book I want to write. And so my beloved husband said, you choose what is most important about John Hay that you want to publish. And it was this chapter in his life, and so I went after it.
Nice. And thank goodness for our spouses for helping us to get to where we need to be.
Absolutely.
Well, given his role in history, it's understandable why this often gets less attention. But with your persuasive argument about how key it is to understand his influence, what can you share with us about John Hay as a poet?
Well, first, he had an innate gift of poetry. I always work with experts in their respective fields when I'm writing a manuscript, regardless of what it is. And one of my experts is a professor of English literature. And he said to me, he said, John Hay was exceptional for his understanding of poetry. And I was like, whoo! It was, like music to my ears. It wasn't just me, but I think this was when he was in college at Brown, and he was very affirmative about that. And so I'll just say that John Hay was a gifted poet, and it comes through in many ways.
Absolutely. And we'll go into this a bit more in our conversation, but it really comes out in your work, how key this was to what he was able to do in his work in the Lincoln administration and how he was able to contribute. It's so amazing that that skill ultimately became so important in a time of crisis for the nation and for the administration.
Yes, and so I came to Lincoln's voice through the prism of John Hay and his writing at Brown University. I would say most or all Lincoln historians come to Lincoln's voice through Lincoln's manuscripts. And I came to it through, reading all of John Hay's blue books and his debates and his poetry at Brown. And so it was just like, aha, it was an aha moment, literally. And his words, his wit, his wisdom. And in his very first year at Brown, he was asked by the administration to be the keynote speaker for the spring, what shall I say? The spring, um
It's like a festival or
Yeah,
workshop.
yeah, and so he was the keynote speaker for that, and he was chosen because of his eloquence and his poetry and his knowledge, and that I do quote most of that speech in the manuscript because it was pretty powerful. So it's not just me saying this about him, it's other people having recognized it.
Absolutely. And I think that's one thing that really comes across in your book that, this time at Brown was so pivotal for him and in shaping who he became. And so I was wondering if you would mind sharing any other insights on this period of his life a bit more and the influence that it had on who he became, and particularly with his service in the Lincoln administration. How did this time really help to shape him and prepare him for that role in his life?
Well, generally fewer than 1% of college age men in the early 1840s, 50s went to college. And John Hay was fortunate enough, his grandfather went to Brown, and his parents could afford one child out of five to go to college, and they chose John because he had the most talent. And during that time, he studied classic Greek and Latin languages. He had access to an Ivy League library. And, you know, in his first year, being able to speak with confidence before a college audience was pretty powerful for this young man who comes from rural Illinois and Indiana and Illinois. So it's pretty remarkable how these pieces come together.
Absolutely. And I loved how you shared, that he definitely dove into the educational aspect of it. And I think you mentioned at one point that there was a subscription library in Providence that he was like the youngest
The
member
Athenaeum.
of.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
But at the same time, you also highlight how he was still sociable. He still had that social life as well, and just trying to balance those two.
I don't know how well he balanced them, but he he really was very sociable, and he joined the Athenaeum early on in his time at Brown, which I think he was the only Brown student who was a member of the Athenaeum, which is still a very revered library in Providence.
Absolutely. And it is interesting, thinking about him in that time and, how impactful that time in college was on him. You see some things that people who have been in college in more recent eras can relate to, just trying to figure it out and trying to reconcile where we came from to where we're going. And I think you do a great job in your book of helping us to understand how that did shape John Hay.
Well, thank you, and thank you for reading the book.
Absolutely. So you describe in your work how John Hay not only served as Lincoln's ghostwriter, but that with the president's knowledge, he went beyond the role of a modern day press secretary in terms of conveying the administration's policy and message by actually writing pieces to be published. And that's such an interesting dimension to his work. And so, Jan, I was wondering, would you mind speaking more to that and how it fits into the Lincoln administration's overall approach to the press?
Great question. So, John Hay had been writing for the press before he started working with Lincoln, and then continuing after his time with Lincoln, and then he really focused his writing for the press to one paper with Lincoln. But then Lincoln says to all of the other press people, I want John Hay to only be my spokesperson for the press. And that was actually it was a bit of a challenge for me to figure out what Lincoln was doing, because I'm pretty certain he was not anti-free press. But here we are in the middle of the Civil War, and the word that gets out from the White House to the rest of the public is so critically important, as I think this is speculation, that Lincoln decided that he wanted John Hay to be his singular spokesperson. And that again, this is speculation. I don't have this from Lincoln's voice, but I just based on everything else I know.
Well, and it's interesting. So many presidents, I'm sure, would have loved to have just had one person to kind of be able to get that message out and to be that person for them. And it's interesting that you bring up that example of Alexander Hamilton and his time under President Washington and that correlation between the two. That was really fascinating. As somebody who's done a deep dive into the Washington presidency, it definitely resonated with me.
Yeah, and this is something that has actually been noted by Lincoln historians, that the Hamilton Washington relationship is very similar to the Hay-Lincoln relationship. And Hay goes home for a respite at his parents in Illinois, and his father says to his brother, he said, you know, John is to Lincoln what Hamilton was to Washington. And to me, that was a bit of a confidence builder in that this is what his role was.
Well, and I just love in your book how you really point out that here John Hay is still a relatively young man. He hasn't had this experience in Washington, and Lincoln has such confidence for him. And you also illustrate how, Lincoln trusted Hay as both an advisor and a personal agent, in addition to these speech writing and trying to get the message out there. He had these other roles as well. And so I was wondering, Jan, what do you think led President Lincoln to convey such trust on someone still relatively young and new to the national political scene?
I don't think that Lincoln, again, this is speculation, but I don't think Lincoln really thought too much about the national political scene as much as he did John Hay's capability with oratory. And so Lincoln was a politician through and through. And what he needed more than anything else was somebody who could transform his political ambitions to pedestrian visions. And that's something that, and really touch people's daily lives. And that's something that John Hay could do very well. And he did. And so it wasn't so much that he was young. First of all, John Hay was a bit of a bon vivant. He was quite certain about his own confidence. But I think that it was really the key ways that he was able to influence Lincoln's visions to the people. And he did that at the Springfield train station that morning, that rainy, dark morning when Lincoln left for Washington. And he did it during, not throughout, but during the train journey. And I think that Lincoln trusted his honor and his tolerance and his honesty. I don't think Hay ever betrayed anybody. Yeah, that's not true. I think he did betray a couple of people, but he didn't betray Lincoln. He was absolutely honest to Lincoln, and he was with him every step of the way.
Absolutely. And I think that comes across. And I think, as I was reading your book, you get the sense that because they came to a place of kind of understanding one another, and in particular, hey, and you think about somebody who is in charge of kind of crafting the image of the president. Of course, you've got to understand them, understand their voice, understand where they're coming from. And you do get the sense in your book that that's kind of what they came to. And that is a massive amount of trust between two people.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. I was recently talking to Stephen Crouppen, who was President Obama's senior speechwriter, and the role of the speechwriter in Obama's day and in Lincoln's day was much different. Much, much different. And so what Hay did for Lincoln is what Lincoln could not have done for himself. And that's so true of many speechwriters, including Sorensen. No way could JFK have dictated the speeches that Ted Sorensen did.
Absolutely. And that's what I love about your work. And we'll get into more of that in a little bit in our conversation. But just the fact that Hay was able to take Lincoln's ideas, take where he was going, and take it to that next level so that, as you said, that it could be relatable. People could understand it. That is that magic sauce that the president may not have, but it helps to connect them to the people.
Yes, absolutely. Because Lincoln dictated to both Hay and Nicolay, who jotted down the notes, and then each of these secretaries, just turned those notes into letters and speeches in a way that Lincoln fired the ideas. And these two young men, Hay especially, turned them into, I don't want to say poetic prose, but turned them into really some mighty testimony.
Absolutely. And that's actually the perfect segue because I would love to hear because we do have George Nicolay in the mix as well, that John Hay is working alongside George Nicolay, Lincoln's private secretary. And so, Jan, I was wondering, what can you tell us about Hay and Nicolay's relationship over the years, and how did their respective roles in the Lincoln administration differ?
So John Hay and George Nicolay met in Pittsfield, Illinois, when George is about, let's say he's 10 years older than John Hay. And he was working for the Pittsfield newspaper at the time. And John Hay was living with his uncle and aunt. And that's how they came into contact with each other. And then Nicolay became I think he became the publisher of the paper when the publisher actually died. And then they turned up together in Springfield working for Lincoln. So it was I think it was mostly chemistry in terms of what brought them together, but they had known each other for quite a while. And then the candidate Lincoln in Springfield hired both Hay and Nicolay, or Nicolay and Hay, to be his, his backup. And they worked together during that time, and they worked together in the same small office. And in fact, let me just back up a bit. Hay was reading for the law under his uncle, Milton Hay, and Nicolay was reading for the law under Lincoln. And they were in the same law offices. They shared a law office together. So it was happenstance that they came together. And then when Lincoln became the Republican presidential candidate, then they joined forces and they worked for Lincoln. But they had a good, they were very different. Oh my goodness, they were so different. John Hay was a bit of a bon vivant, and George Nicolay was a bit of a acerbic, I don't know, something or other, but he didn't tolerate people as well as John did, and he wasn't that funny, and he also got sick a lot, so he was out of the office a lot, but they got along well.
Well, and it was interesting. It sounded like from your book that Nicolay was more of the let's keep things moving, trying to be that gatekeeper for Lincoln and it was interesting to see, that they really did have those different functions in the administration and both had important functions in the administration.
They did, and very different.
Yes. And then the fact that their relationship keeps on, even after Lincoln's passing, that they worked together on the biography of Lincoln afterwards.
Yes. Yes. They remained very close even after Lincoln's presidency.
Absolutely. Well, and one thing that I want to highlight that stood out to me about your work is that in many instances, you put Lincoln's speeches that Hay contributed to in kind of a poetic format. And that's atypical to how I've seen them printed in the past. And I think that maybe, like you said, coming to it from the lens of Hay versus so many other scholars that come at it from the lens of, Lincoln's speeches. And so I was wondering if that was how they've been found in some existing primary sources, or was that format meant to reflect how Hay likely thought of them while crafting the speeches?
The latter. I presented them in a way that I was thinking that Hay crafted the speeches in the verse that he was most familiar with and most comfortable with. So that's what I did, and In fact, one of my readers said, "Can you just tell everybody why you're doing this?" And I honestly, I have to tell you, Jerry, I forgot to do it. But it's really the way that it's the verse that Hay would have used as he was crafting these speeches in his poetic style.
Absolutely. And as an English major, it resonated with my heart. I loved it because I think it really helps the reader to understand some of the evidence that you're presenting in terms of the poetic format that really was Hay in there.
Hay's voice.
Yes.
Yes.
So I think that really works as a mechanism to help the reader to understand that.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. And I should have been clearer about that.
No worries, and I assumed that was the case, but I don't like to assume, and also wanted to give you a chance to talk about it. It's wonderful to kinda get behind the scenes of the thought process put into such an amazing work.
Mhm. Thank you.
So, Chan, there are so many of Lincoln's key speeches and documents that Hay played a role in, but I couldn't resist asking you about the Gettysburg Address, which, as you note, Lincoln was undecided up to the day prior to departure as to whether he was actually going to deliver remarks at the dedication ceremony or not. Would you mind telling us more about the decision to deliver the address and Hay's role in crafting it?
So the decision to deliver the address came from his cabinet, and it was the day before they were to leave to go down to Gettysburg if they were going to go to Gettysburg. And he met with his cabinet last minute, and they said, "Yes, we think you should." So now that piece is recorded. The next piece is speculation. I believe that Hay stepped in, and since Lincoln was the Republican presidential candidate in January of 1861, quote unquote, this is from Michael Burlingame. Lincoln dictated as Hay and Nicolay jotted down notes the process for each secretary's daily output of 75 letters or more. So that was a bit of an affirmation for me that what Lincoln often did, and this you'll see in the book from John Hay's diary, is what Lincoln will say to Hay. It appears in John Hay's diary, and I think what happened after the cabinet meeting is then Lincoln and Hay either sat down or talked, and Hay stepped in. Lincoln dictated to him, and then Hay went to work. Let me step forward a bit. After Lincoln was nominated to be the president of the United States, Hay said, "My work is not yet done. I have to go home and write his acceptance speech." This is in writing. This is known. So I'm not speculating here that he did this.
Mhm.
This is what he did. This was his job. And this was like 2 o'clock in the morning after Lincoln had won the presidential election. And then he gave that speech. So it's well known that Lincoln often edited the drafts that were created for him. And there's some notes from Nicolay that the next morning Lincoln made some adjustments to his speech, but that's quite typical of Lincoln, that he would massage the speech that he was to give. And so that's my speculation, is that after the cabinet meeting the day before, Lincoln and Hay got together, and then Hay did a draft, and then Lincoln continued to refine it. And Hay said, as Lincoln was giving the speech that it was so much. I'm not going to say this clearly, but it was so much more eloquent than he ever expected. So he was very pleased with his execution.
Well, and as we've seen, that speech continues to resonate through history to the very present, and it really is, for such a short speech, the poetic elements of it, I think, is part of the reason why it is so well remembered and so well revered. But I did like how you noted that it took some time before folks really saw it as important as we now think of it nowadays, that there was kind of a lag on that for a while.
Some people thought it was too short. Yeah.
Well, and especially considering Edward Everett's, I think it was 2 hours.
2 hours.
And he just gets up for a couple of minutes. So John Hay was only 26 when President Lincoln was assassinated. But as you note, through the next 4 decades up to his death, he continued to speak of Lincoln. And it was clear that the fallen president was one of the greatest influences on him. So what would you say are some key ways that Lincoln influenced who John Hay became, and in particular, his approach to the role of Secretary of State at the end of his life?
Well, there's a couple of a few characteristics that they both shared, and some that John Hay didn't share that Lincoln impressed on him. One is tolerance. Lincoln really impressed on John Hay tolerance. The other was measured action. Just he felt that John Hay was a little bit too quick-witted, and his decisiveness, and he really impressed on him the importance of decisiveness. The other, and they shared this, John Hay growing up on the Mississippi River and Lincoln working on the Mississippi River, he said, act based on what you know and what you see rather than what you want to see. And Lincoln and Hay were both really devotees of that of that point of view, that the river will define what you know, where you go, what you see, rather than what you want to see, because the river is, the arbiter of it. And so I think that those characteristics really stayed with John Hay during his life after Lincoln. Tolerance, measured action, decisiveness, and act based on what you see and know rather than what you want to know. And we all have a little bit of experience with that contrary behavior.
Absolutely. Well, and as we wrap up our conversation, I couldn't help but ask, taking it in the other direction from my previous question, what would you say are some key ways that John Hay influenced Lincoln's historical legacy and how he is viewed in the public consciousness even up to the present day?
Well, I think one of the most important pieces is the 10-volume history of Lincoln that John Hay and Nicolay wrote, and it really established the precis of Lincoln history. And in my opinion, to the contrary, because, for example, Hay didn't want a chapter on the Gettysburg Address. And Bob Lincoln said, I do. And so Nicolay wrote it, but they left a lot out. So, I mean, I think that what they didn't write informed as much about Lincoln history as what they did write. And what they did write was based on what they knew, what they read, and that was it, because they didn't trust people just remembering things. They trusted only what was written. So I think one of the most important influences that Hay had on Lincoln was his oratory. He was known as one of the most eloquent presidents in U.S. history. And yet we all have to ask, How did an individual with so little education become one of the most gifted spokespersons in public life? And that's the big question.
Absolutely. And I think it's a question that you help us as readers and students of history to better understand with this work. So I thank you so much for your work on this. For our listeners, the book is Lincoln's Speechwriter, John Hay and the Friendship That Inspired American Eloquence. There is so much more that we weren't able to get to in this conversation, so I cannot recommend enough that everybody go and pick it up. Jan, thank you so much, and congratulations on the publication of this great book.
Thank you, Jerry. And it goes on sale tomorrow. And Jerry, I would just like to say thank you so much for reading the book.
No worries. Like I said, that's one of the perks of being a history podcaster. I'm like, I want to read all the books. And so it's always great to be able to read and to be able to have a discussion with the author and historian, because there's so many questions whenever you're reading that you just really want to ask. And so I get to do that. I love that opportunity.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much again to Jan Cigliano Hartman for her time and for the insight she provided in our discussion. I highly recommend you pick up a copy of her book, Lincoln's Speechwriter, John Hay and the Friendship That Inspired American Eloquence, as she goes into further detail about John Hay's life, career, and relationship with President Lincoln than we had time to discuss in this conversation. I'll have a link on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. There you can also find past episodes of the podcast, links to more about all the American presidents, and information on how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help to support the Presidency's podcast. Thanks so much to our patrons, whose financial support ensures that I have the equipment and resources needed to keep this good work going. As a token of my appreciation, all patrons get access to an ad-free feed for the podcast, which includes some special patron-exclusive episodes. I just finished up a series on the Postmasters General prior to the office becoming a cabinet-level post. And next up, I'm going to share some outtakes from the Calhoun episode. If you'd like to become a patron of the Presidency's podcast, just go to patreon.com/presidencies and sign up. If you're not able to commit to a monthly donation, there are other ways you can support the podcast. I have a research wish list available at tinyurl.com/presidenciespodcast with books identified that will help to prepare for upcoming episodes. You can also leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podchaser, or anywhere else with that capability. I cannot thank all of you who have fulfilled book requests as well as shared with folks why they too should be listening to the Presidency's podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email me at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. You can also reach out on social media if you're not connected with me there already. I'm available on Facebook, Blue Sky, and Mastodon as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidency's Podcast. Last but certainly not least, I thank you so much for listening. Until next time, stay safe and healthy. Be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
I'm Ken Harbaugh, host of Burn the Boats from Evergreen Podcasts. I interview political leaders and influencers, folks like award-winning journalist Soledad O'Brien and conservative columnist Bill Kristol, about the choices they confront when failure is not an option. I won't agree with everyone I talk to, but I respect anyone who believes in something enough to risk everything for it. Because history belongs to those willing to burn the boats. Episodes are out every other week wherever you get your podcasts.